Hi guys, Irina here and welcome back to my channel where I review everything tech. A few weeks ago, I did the unboxing video of this OnePlus Nord N200, the new budget model from OnePlus. The thing about this phone that seems the most appealing to me is the price. And after spending a few weeks with the OnePlus N200, I'm back with the review, so let's begin. Honestly, when I just opened the box, I was surprised how good this phone looked, because the N200 does not look like a budget phone. Despite the fact that we have a plastic back and a glossy plastic frame on this phone, the N200 looks and feels really similar to my OnePlus 9 Pro that has a glass back and a metal frame. So yeah, this phone doesn't look like a $200-something phone. Well, good job OnePlus on the design of the N200. When it comes to the display of this phone, we have a pretty large panel here. This is a 6.49-inch AMOLED display, and as I've already mentioned in my unboxing video, surprisingly, this display is pretty sharp, which actually doesn't happen often when it comes to budget phones. And this display supports a 90 Hz refresh rate, which I always welcome. Speaking of brightness, as expected, the N200 is not as bright as, say, the OnePlus 9 Pro. However, I don't have any viewing problems indoors. For instance, it always seems enough for me to scroll through Instagram feed and watch YouTube. The only thing I wish this phone had is the screen calibration feature that we have pretty much on all of the OnePlus models, where you could calibrate your display up to your taste. And the thing is, the display on the N200 seems too vivid to me, as I prefer more natural colors. When it comes to display features, I've already showed you some of them in my unboxing video, and here you could adjust the color balance of the display, which is great, but you cannot really change the saturation. So all the photos on Instagram and videos on YouTube look more vivid, and honestly, I'm not a fan of this, but some people like it, so it really comes down to your preferences, guys. I usually don't pay much attention to haptics since most of the time it just feels good on the other phones, but this phone actually made me notice and pay more attention to it because the vibration on this phone feels so old-fashioned and cheap. It feels like I'm holding a very old phone from the very early 2000s, and honestly, the first thing I did was disable all the haptics on this phone. And speaking of other little details, this phone does not have my favorite alert slider that we usually have on the OnePlus phones, so yeah, no slider on the N200. Next, let's talk about the camera setup of this phone, and here we have three cameras: the main camera, the macro camera, and the monochrome camera. And I totally understand that they didn't put a telephoto camera on this phone since we usually see them on the more high-end models, but I was surprised that there is no ultra-wide camera on the N200 since we've already seen so many budget phones with ultra-wide cameras in the same price range. Instead, we get a monochrome and a macro camera on this phone, and while the macro camera can come in handy at times, I'm not so sure about the monochrome camera. Yes, I guess it could be fun to take some monochrome photos at times. However, honestly, I don't think it has much of a practical use for an average user, so to me it feels more like a marketing move since on paper I get a triple camera on this phone, but in fact, the only camera I would actually use would be the main camera. When it comes to camera features, here we have pretty much all the features that you would get on much more expensive phones, like the night mode, portrait mode, slow-mo, time-lapse, and so on. And let's take a look at some photos I've taken with the OnePlus N200, and you can judge them for yourself. it comes to videos, you're limited to 1080p resolution and 30 frames per second on this phone, so just keep in mind that you cannot film 4K videos on the OnePlus N200. Speaking of the front camera, we have a 16-megapixel camera on this phone, and these are some of the selfies and videos I've taken with the OnePlus N200. If you ask me, the camera on the N200 is quite mediocre. It's not bad, but don't expect outstanding shots from this phone since you will experience some mishaps with exposure at times. Also, to me, the photos from the N200 often lack sharpness. Next, let's talk about the battery of this phone. We have a 5000 mAh battery on the OnePlus N200, and speaking of battery life, this phone is actually pretty good. It can easily last you through the day with moderate use. I have to admit, I feel really comfortable with this phone in terms of battery life. So yeah, this is definitely a huge advantage of this phone. Speaking of charging, I did a charging test in my unboxing video, and it took 2 hours and 35 minutes to fully charge this phone from 0% to 100, which is pretty slow. Especially when it comes to OnePlus, the company that, in my opinion, has some of the best fast charging tech. Also, it's important to note that the OnePlus N200 does not support wireless charging. Now let's talk about biometrics and security features. We have a side-mounted fingerprint sensor on the power button on the right, and I've already mentioned in my unboxing video that this is one of my favorite locations for a fingerprint sensor. I think it's really convenient, especially if you're righty, but if you're lefty, you could use your index finger, which also feels pretty comfortable. Speaking of other security features, we have a face unlock on this phone, and just like the fingerprint sensor, it's pretty fast, no complaints here. The next thing I want to talk about is speakers, but it would be more correct to say a speaker because we only have a single speaker on this phone. This in-display speaker doesn't actually work as a speaker when you're listening to music, watching videos, or playing games. However, this bottom speaker is actually pretty good in terms of volume since it can get pretty loud. But keep in mind that if you accidentally cover the bottom speaker, the sound becomes pretty much non-existent. We have a 3.5mm headphone jack on this phone, so if you have a pair of your favorite wired headphones, you could still enjoy them on the OnePlus N200. This phone runs on Snapdragon 480 5G, it comes with 4GB of RAM, and when it comes to the overall performance of this phone, I cannot call it seamless. It's not bad, but it's definitely not smooth. You will experience some slight freezes and stutters from time to time. Also, sometimes it takes forever to install an app or a game, especially when it comes to heavy and demanding ones like Call of Duty or Asphalt 8. By the way, I wanted to play the Asphalt 9, but this phone is not even compatible with it. However, I have to admit, the gaming experience was still pretty good on this phone. There have been just a few slight frame drops, but I haven't noticed any serious problems, even with some of the most demanding games. It's important to note that this phone comes with only 64GB of storage, but thankfully it's expandable, so you could bring it up to 256GB. So, despite all the shortcomings that I've mentioned in this video, this phone is more than capable of doing some basic tasks and running apps like Instagram or YouTube, so if that's what you need, I would say this phone is a great option to pick. Yes, the camera is not the best, the overall performance is not the best, but for just $240, I think this phone does its job. That's all for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.